When people come to my shop, one of the things they ask me often is, what kind of lathe should they buy? And lathes are certainly fundamental to wood turning. So this video is going to talk a little bit about features of lathes and considerations when purchasing a lathe. There are three different considerations when buying a lathe. One is capacity, one is convenience, and one is engineering. So I'm going to talk a little bit about capacity, convenience, and engineering. The capacity of a lathe is generally measured by the size of the disc it can turn. In this case, this is called a 1220 lathe. It means that the distance between the bed and the center of the spindle is 6 inches, so theoretically it can turn a 12-inch disc. Now, that would be pushing it. It would have to be pretty perfectly round in order to turn a 12-inch disc on the lathe. Another measure they typically give you is the height over the banjo. This is the banjo that holds the tool rest. And the height over the banjo on this one is 4.5 inches, meaning that theoretically you could turn 9 inches over the banjo. The second measure on the lathe is the capacity in terms of the length of things you can turn. And this is called a 20-inch lathe. So this would be a 1220-inch lathe. And that is the distance between the centers of the, from the headstock to the tailstock that you could turn. Capacity has a lot to do with what you want to do with the lathe. If you want to turn pins or bottle stoppers or small bowls, this is plenty of lathe to do it. You don't need a large Powermatic lathe to do small objects. And in fact, I use this lathe a lot more than I use my larger lathe because a lot of the things I turn are relatively small. Let's talk about engineering. The lathe consists of the bed, the tailstock, the headstock, the motor, and the tool rest. This banjo needs to move smoothly on the bed. It needs to lock down securely, and it has a cam on it, and the tool rest needs to lock securely. This is cast iron. This is steel screws and steel other components. Sometimes the tool rest is cast iron, but the point is that it needs to lock securely and not be flimsy and not strip out with normal use. The tailstock, in this case, has what is called a self-ejecting quill. So if I crank it this way, the live center will come out of the quill. The lathe also is measured in terms of the headstock spindle. This is a 1/8 spindle, meaning that it's 1 inch in diameter and has 8 threads per inch. It's a standard measure for chucks and other accessories like a faceplate. When you buy your accessories or you buy your lathe, you tell them you want something that will match your spindle. In this case, it's a 1/8. This has a number 2 Mars taper. The taper is very common in lathes, so that the things that you put into the lathe to hold the wood, like the spur drive and the live center, fit into that taper, and then whatever you're turning will go between the tailstock and the headstock. This is called a quill or a tailstock spindle, and it turns into the wood, and typically the length of the tailstock spindle is about, the travel of the tailstock spindle is 2.5 inches or so. On a larger lathe, sometimes it's up to 4 inches or 6 inches. And that makes a difference in terms of how you can secure the wood. And The motors on most lathes are determined by horsepower. This is a 3/4 horsepower motor, and most of the times the motors are matched to the size of the lathe, such that the motor that you get will be sufficient for doing the things that that lathe can do. And on a mini lathe, they'll typically run between 1/2 horsepower, and the newer mini lathe that Jet makes is a full 1 horsepower motor. The headstock of the lathe has bearings in it, and the quality of the bearings are a feature of engineering. A well-engineered lathe will have a good flat bed, easy moving banjo, well locking down on the tailstock, and a spindle lock that will lock the spindle, the tailstock spindle or quill, down tight. In engineering also, the weight of the lathe, or the cast iron body of the lathe, is important to consider, because when wood is turning and it's a little off balance, the lathe's going to vibrate, and a good solid cast iron base is a feature that will make sure that things stay aligned and they don't vibrate as much as it would be if it wasn't a good solid base. So that's part of engineering. Now, what about convenience? Well, one convenience factor to consider is what voltage does the lathe run at? If you're in a small shop and you only have 110 volts, which is the common AC voltage in homes, you don't want a lathe that requires 220 volts in order to run the motor, unless you want to rewire the shop. Also, how much space does the lathe take up? If you have a limited amount of space, a midi lathe like this on a stand takes up the minimum amount of room, and that's a convenience. An accessory like this is a variable speed motor. I can control the speed with an electronic control box with a knob, and that's definitely a convenience. On most lathes, you can change the speed by using belts, and on this one too, and I'll show you that in a minute. But having the variable speed allows you to turn it down when you're starting and turn it up a little bit later when your piece is in balance and all roughed out. The quality of the components that you get with the lathe, generally with the lathe you get a live center, you get a spur drive, you get a knockout bar to remove the spur drive, and you get a faceplate. The faceplate is going to be suitable for the size of the lathe. The spur drive and the live center will also be suitable. They have a sealed bearing in them. And so these are things that will get you started on the lathe. The tool rest that you get with the lathe, in this case, this tool rest is nice if I'm doing something long, but I bought an accessory tool rest that I use most of the time, and that's an extra cost. The stand is usually an extra cost also. Very few mini lathes come with a stand, and so the stand in these cases will run between $200 and $400. That'll add to the price of your lathe. Mini lathes you can get them from $400 to $800 for the lathe. Again, if you consider the stand and maybe a few extra accessories, you're going to be paying between $500 and $1,000 for the lathe. Let's look at another feature of the lathes and to take into consideration, and that is how the speed is controlled. Behind the speed control box is a set of pulleys that's connected to the motor, and another set of pulleys in the headstock. And I can vary the speed of the lathe by loosening the motor and changing the pulley that the belts are on. Now, an electronically variable speed lathe, I most of the time leave the speed for this lathe in the middle range, in the mid-speed range, from 700 to 1800 RPMs. But I can change that speed range by changing where the pulley is on the belt. Now, in terms of engineering and convenience, this isn't the most convenient setup of the lathes in terms of changing pulleys, but it works. Okay, let's look at a different lathe. This is a Nova 1624 lathe, which means that the center to the bed is 8 inches and 24 inches between centers. In most lathes, the jet that you saw a minute ago, the MIDI lathe, and this lathe can be extended by buying another section of bed. So in order to make this a 44-inch lathe, I would buy a 20-inch extension that would go on the end of the lathe. This lathe has a 1.5 horsepower motor, but it does not have variable speed. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 steps on the pulley, so it has 8 different speeds that I can get by changing the belt on the pulley. And on this lathe, changing the belt is much more convenient than it is on the jet. I just open this door, raise the motor on a cam, and I can change the belt quickly from one speed to another. When I say quickly, I'm talking about 20-30 seconds. Put the motor back down. The speed range is shown. So a little window here, you can see where the belt is, and you can read what the speed is. In this particular case, the speed is 684 RPMs. Just like the other lathe, it has a cast iron bed. The banjo locks down with a cam type shaft. It has a very sturdy screw to hold the tool rest so it doesn't move. The tailstock also has a sturdy cam lock, and the quill has a quill lock. Unlike the other lathe, this lathe does not automatically eject the live center. You get a knockout bar that you use to push the live center out. Also, the hand wheel on the back of this spindle is an accessory on this lathe. So there's another $35 that you have to add to the price of the lathe. This lathe has a forward, off, and reverse motor control. The reverse speed is nice for sanding, and some people even turn in reverse mode. The lathe also has a 1 1/4/8 spindle. You can see that the spindle, the faceplate from the jet lathe won't fit on this lathe. This spindle is much more substantial for turning larger bowls, spindles, or platters. And you can see the faceplate is much more substantial. Now, one feature of a number of lathes on the market is that the headstock will turn to 45 degrees or even 90 degrees for outboard turning. With 45 degrees, you can use the tool rest that's on here to turn something that's a little larger than you could over the bed. But also if you turn it out 90 degrees and you add a $250 accessory, you could now turn on this lathe something that was up to about 28 inches. Remember, it can't hit here. So the capacity of this lathe is increased by the feature that allows the head to swivel around on the lathe. Then the head locks down with a screw so that you don't get vibration. So this lathe, without the accessories, runs about $1,400, and it comes with the stand or the legs with it. So by the time you get done tricking out a mini jet lathe, you could have this lathe, but you give up the convenience of variable speed and have to change the belts in order to change your speed. Here's a 14-inch diameter bowl blank mounted on the Nova lathe to give you some idea of the capacity of the lathe. The last lathe I'm going to talk about is this Powermatic. The last lathe I'm going to talk about is this Powermatic lathe. This is a 3520, meaning that the distance between the bed and the center of the motor spindle is 10 inches, and that that's the 20 part, and then it'll turn something 35 inches between centers. Now, if I wanted to turn a baseball bat, I would need something of at least that capacity in order to be able to do the spindle. Of course, I could turn the baseball bat on either the jet or the Nova lathe if I had a bed extension. The motor on this lathe is a 2 horsepower motor, and it means that I have to have a 220 volt circuit in order to run it. And it's a 3-phase motor, meaning that it's controlled electronically variable speed control, such that I can control it from off to full speed with a speed control dial. It also has a belt and 2 pulleys for a high speed and a low speed speed control. I leave it on high speed, and if I needed to go on low speed for some operation like sanding, where I wanted an even lower speed, or painting or decorating, I can do that by moving the belts. That gives me a different speed range on my speed control. This lathe has 2 screws on the 2 screws to hold the tool rest. That secures it. It's way out here. The torque from turning something can pull it in, but this secures it very well. The tail stock quill comes out at least 4.5 inches, giving you more flexibility in turning spindles, or even coming to the inside of bowls if you want to support a bowl while you're turning it on the lathe. You saw where the clearance on the other lathe for a 14-inch turning. You can see this lathe, you have plenty of clearance for a 14-inch platter or bowl. The tailstock quill is self-ejecting, so if I pull it back, it will knock that center loose. It comes with a safety cage that you can pull down over your piece when you're turning. I find it is a convenient tool holder, but I don't use it for the safety cage because I wear a shield when I'm turning on something like this. I've added a magnetic strip on front for convenience to hold my tools while I'm working. This lathe does not come with an index spindle stop, but I can put an indexing pad on the front here, and I use a little pin that goes into the headstock in order to index something if I need to do that. Another feature of this lathe is a remote switch that I can use to turn the lathe off and on from the end of the lathe down by the tailstock. And a feature of this lathe and other lathes like it are that the headstock will move along the bed and can be locked down along the way. And so if you're turning a large bowl off the end or a hollow form, you can move it down to where you can stand off the end of the lathe and turn. I've added a swing away tail rest so I can get the tool rest out of the way. I can move the tool rest out this way and turn off the end of the lathe. That's a convenience on your back and also for sanding and things like that. These lathes, when I bought this 10 years ago, were $2,500. They're now around $4,000. There are some little improvements they've made to them, but they really hold their value well. And if you invest in a lathe like this, you'll more than likely get your money back out of it when you go to sell it, if you ever sell it. So I hope this video has given you a little more information that might help you in your thinking about a lathe and what you would like. Just remember the three components of choosing a lathe are capacity, will it turn, what it is you want to turn, and don't overbuy a lathe if you don't plan to use it. Convenience, will it fit where you want it to fit? Does it use the power that you have available? Does it have the accessories and things that you need to do what you want to do? And then the third, engineering. Is it a machine that will last and hold up? Is it well built, sturdy, secure? Is it something that will hold its value for when you want to move up to another lathe, that you can trade it in or sell it for approximately what you paid for it? So those are the three considerations I have for you. All I have to say is happy turning, and please share this video with your friends that might be considering buying a lathe.